Welcome back for another deep dive. This one is about something you might not think too much about, salt. You sent over some research about how it connects to hypertension in lower income families. And, well, honestly, I'm super curious to dig in with you.
Yeah, it's easy to just think about salt as like, oh, taste, right? But it's really tied into so many other things.
Hmm.
Economics, culture, even health.
Right. And the research we're looking at today is this proposal by Abdullah Fitrah. They're at UAN Alauddin in Makassar. They're looking specifically at families in Goa Regency, Indonesia. Could you maybe give us a quick overview of this proposal? What is it about this one that caught your eye?
Absolutely. So Fitra is researching salt consumption, specifically how it relates to hypertension risk. And the families they're looking at are lower income families. But what really makes this research stand out is that they're using what's called the sunrise model. Are you familiar with that?
Not until I saw this proposal.
It's really fascinating. It basically says that, well, health isn't just about like what an individual decides to do, right? You need to take into account like the whole context of their life, their culture, their values, even just their lifestyle. So in this case, it's not just about like measuring how much salt people are eating, but really trying to understand what's driving those choices,
Yeah.
culturally and economically.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about understanding the why behind the what.
Exactly. Now, before we get too deep into Fitra's research and the sunrise model, I think it might be helpful to like set the stage. You sent over some info about hypertension.
Yeah,
Okay.
hypertension is definitely a global issue. But what's the situation in Indonesia in particular?
Well, based on the latest data from the Indonesian Ministry of Health from 2023, they estimate there are over 63 million cases. That's, let me see, 63,309,620 to be exact. And even worse, 427,218 deaths are attributed to hypertension. And we zoom in on the region where this research is focused. Go Regency has the third highest prevalence of hypertension in the whole province of South Sulawesi.
So, definitely a region where this type of research is, well, desperately needed. How do the numbers break down by age? Is there like a specific group that's especially vulnerable?
Yeah, that's a good question. It looks like the age groups with the highest prevalence in Indonesia are adults between 31 and 64.
That's, wow, a big part of the population, people who are in their prime working years.
Right, which makes it even more concerning. And, one of the biggest factors behind this high prevalence of hypertension is, no surprise here, salt.
Okay, so let's talk about salt. Explain to me how salt affects blood pressure. Like, we hear it's bad for us, but I'm curious about the science of it.
Sure, sure. Basically, salt, or more specifically, the sodium in salt, it messes with the balance of fluids in our body. So when you eat a lot of salt, your body actually holds on to more water, and that increases your blood volume, which in turn increases your blood pressure.
So it's like, imagine adding more liquid to a system of pipes. The pressure goes up.
That's a great way to put it. But it's not just about the volume. Sodium also affects how your blood vessels actually function. Like it makes them less flexible. Kind of like if you imagine a garden hose stiffening up. You need more pressure to get the same amount of water through.
That's a good way to visualize it. More fluid and stiffer pipes. No wonder our hearts have to work harder.
Exactly. And that's why this research, focusing on lower income families, is so important. They often have real challenges when it comes to having a healthy diet, low sodium. Do you see a connection between their financial limitations and the food choices they might be making that could, well, increase their risk of hypertension?
I mean, I can imagine how someone with a tight budget might not be able to buy fresh produce all the time, and processed foods, well, they're often cheaper and easier to get.
That's right. And unfortunately, a lot of those processed foods are just packed with sodium, partly because of how they're made. Salt is a cheap and easy way to preserve food and make it taste better. But for those families who are really trying to stretch their budget, it's kind of a catch-22.
Like trying to put food on the table, but maybe harming your health in the process.
It's tough. And that's where Abdullah Fitrah's research is really valuable because it's looking at these complex dynamics
Yeah.
and, trying to figure out solutions that will actually work for these families. And that's where the sunrise model comes in. Because it's not just about telling people to eat less salt, but helping them understand why that's important and how to make it happen in their own lives.
Let's talk about that, the sunrise model. I have to say, I am really intrigued by how it incorporates culture into thinking about health. It's a whole new way of looking at things.
Yeah, it's really like a whole different way of approaching health. The sunrise model focuses on three main concepts: culture care preservation, culture care accommodation, and then culture care repatterning.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those actually look like in the real world?
So let's start with that first one, culture care preservation. Basically, it's about acknowledging and respecting the existing cultural practices around food, and that includes salt. Instead of coming in with like a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to health, you first try to understand why people do what they do, what these traditions mean to them.
Gotcha, gotcha. So it's about like respecting those traditions instead of just being like, nope, that's unhealthy, stop it.
Exactly. And then from there, you move to culture care accommodation, and that's where you really try to work with those existing cultural practices,
Hmm.
and see if you can find healthier solutions. So instead of just saying, stop eating that, it's more like, okay, so how can we tweak this traditional dish? How can we make it lower in sodium without sacrificing flavor?
Do you have an example of what that might look like?
Well, okay, say a community health worker is trying to help a family eat less instant noodles. Fitra actually talks about that specifically in their proposal. A lot of lower-income families really rely on those prepackaged meals, right? They're cheap, they're convenient, but, well, they're also really high in sodium.
Yeah, I see the problem. They're budget friendly, maybe, but not exactly heart healthy.
Right. So instead of just saying, don't eat those anymore, someone using the sunrise model, like that health worker, might help the family figure out like ways to change how they make those noodles. Maybe drain some of that salty brawn or only use half the seasoning packet, or even just adding in some extra veggies and maybe some lean protein.
So it's more about like finding ways to like lower the sodium without completely overhauling what they normally eat. Do you think that actually like works?
There's actually some research that suggests it can be more effective than just, giving people a list of rules, do this, don't do that. People are way more likely to stick to changes when they feel like understood and like they have some control over it, not like they're being judged or something.
It kind of reminds me of those cooking shows where they take like a really rich dish and they, healthify it, but without making it taste bad.
I love that analogy. It's about being creative, showing that healthy eating doesn't have to be boring or like bland and restrictive. It can be about celebrating those cultural traditions, but in like new and exciting ways.
Speaking of traditions, you mentioned how Fitrah's proposal points out that a lot of Indonesian cuisine already like has a preference for salty flavors. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Indonesia has a super rich and diverse culinary heritage, and salt is, well, it's just a really important ingredient in a lot of their traditional dishes. The research specifically mentions like salted fish, also pickled vegetables, and even using flavor enhancers like MSG.
I've definitely heard of MSG, but I have to admit I don't really know what it is. Is it like actually bad for you the way some people say?
MSG is one of those ingredients that gets like a lot of bad press, but the science on it is complicated. It actually stands for monosodium glutamate, and it's a naturally occurring amino acid, and it basically enhances savory flavors. You can find it in a lot of foods naturally, like tomatoes, even cheese, but it's also produced commercially and added to all sorts of processed foods.
So why all the controversy?
So back in the 1960s, there were some like reports of people having like headaches, maybe sweating, chest pain after eating Chinese food, which, as you know, often uses MSG. And that's where the whole Chinese restaurant syndrome thing came from. And well, MSG got a really bad reputation really fast.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about that. But you're saying the science doesn't really back that up.
So there have been a ton of studies since then, and they really haven't found any like conclusive evidence that MSG is linked to like serious health problems. The FDA even says it's safe when it's eaten in moderation.
Wow, that's interesting. So it seems like the perception of MSG is like more of a cultural issue than like a scientific one.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's important to remember that food isn't always just about nutrition. You know, it's about culture, it's about history, and even like personal experiences.
And sometimes those perceptions can be really hard to change, even if the science is pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely. But getting back to salt and the sunrise model, I think that's one reason why culture care repatterning is so crucial.
Okay, remind me, what's repatterning about again?
So it's about working with people so that they can, modify practices that might be harmful to their health. But it's got to be done in a way that is sensitive and respectful because these practices are often really deeply rooted in their culture.
So not like dictating changes, but working together with communities to like figure out solutions that, actually fit their values and their needs.
Exactly. And that might mean partnering with community leaders, maybe even like elders or other people who are really influential to promote ways of cooking that are healthier, or even advocating for changes in like how food is prepared and sold in the community.
It's like a bottom-up approach to health, where you work within the existing social structures.
Exactly. It's about empowering communities to, like, take charge of their own health.
That makes a lot of sense. So what does Fitrah's research propose as like specific interventions they could try in Goa Regency?
Well, Fitra proposes kind of a multi-pronged approach,
Yeah.
addressing both individual behaviors and like broader community level factors. One idea is working with the local markets, trying to make fresh produce more accessible for lower income families, maybe offering discounts, even starting community gardens.
Oh, that's a cool idea. I like that. What about working with families more directly?
Yeah, that's a big piece of it too. Fitra talks about working with like women's groups, maybe to organize some cooking classes. And in those classes, they could teach people like how to adapt those traditional Indonesian dishes, but, make them lower in sodium. And they talk about how if those classes are led by like respected community members, then the advice will actually be more impactful.
It's kind of a mix of education and like empowerment, right? Give people the knowledge and the tools they need to make those healthier choices, but within their own cultural context.
Exactly. And it goes even beyond that. Futura even suggests working with like local food vendors, maybe encouraging them to offer lower sodium options or, at the very least putting clear labels on things so you can see how much salt is in different dishes.
Yeah, that way people can at least make informed choices, even if they're still, craving those saltier flavors. It's really interesting to see how this model can be applied on so many different levels, right? Like from individual choices to community-wide initiatives and even policy changes.
Yeah, it's like a systems thinking approach, recognizing that, well, health isn't just about personal responsibility, right? It's about creating a whole environment that supports well-being.
Wow, this deep dive has really changed the way I think about salt, I gotta say. I am definitely going to be paying closer attention to those food labels now.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty wild how something so basic, so simple as salt can actually be so complex when you really dig into it. All the cultural stuff, the economics, even like the psychology of it all.
So as we wrap up, what's the like key takeaway you hope our listener is walking away with today?
Hmm. I'd say, well, the next time you reach for that salt shaker, think about the bigger picture. Think about all those things that shape our tastes, our choices, and remember that even small changes, even tiny ones, can really make a big difference for our health.
I love that. Beautifully put. Is there anything else our listener could maybe like explore on their own if they want to learn more about these interconnected systems? I remember you mentioning something about food sovereignty earlier. What's that all about?
Oh, food sovereignty is a really cool concept. Basically, it says that people should have the right to healthy food, food that's culturally appropriate for them, and that food should be produced in a way that's good for the planet, and good for the people who are producing and eating it.
It makes you think about like where our food comes from and like who benefits from how it gets made and sold and all that.
Exactly. And I think it really ties into what we've been talking about today. It challenges us to go beyond just individual choices, you know, and to think about all those systems that are shaping our health. Do people have access to fresh produce, and can they afford it? Are those traditional foodways being like respected and supported? Those are all questions that relate to food sovereignty and ultimately to our well-being.
Yeah. It's not just about like using less salt. It's about like asking bigger questions. Like how do we get our food? How do we share it? Who gets to eat?
It's a journey. It's about becoming more aware, and hopefully that awareness leads to positive change.
Well, I've definitely got a lot to think about after this deep dive. I'll tell you that. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been a pleasure discussing this research with you. It's such important work.
And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey exploring salt and culture and health. Remember, even those little changes can make a big difference. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning,